Okay, so in this paper, the authors are working on predicting and finding suicide risk factors from Twitter data. And the motivation is supported by the fact that suicide ranks as the second leading cause of death among individuals 25 to 34 years old. Less than 50% of suicide victims contact a mental health or primary care provider within 1 month of their suicide attempts. As such, there is more interest in leveraging social media platforms to detect suicidality outside the healthcare delivery system. And the objective here is to learn more about what are the suicide risk factors and relationships between them, with the expectations that the outcomes of this research, the findings could be potentially useful to guide early interventions to prevent suicide attempts. Okay. There is related work in this area, most of it done on suicide letters on which natural language processing approaches were applied to distinguish between classes of suicide notes, of completeness versus not. Self-administered risk assessment tools has shown that adolescents with previous suicide attempts have many physical risk factors, such as history of past attempt, current suicidal ideation, and depression. And these findings from the related works were based on small scale data, meaning limited number of suicide letters. As a conclusion of the literature review that has been performed, further investigations are needed in order to generalize the findings on with respect to this suicide factor risk work. Social media such as Twitter has been used to understand more about suicide. And social media, as currently, was used for promoting positive behaviors to help seeking for depression management, surviving social needs, as well as for preferences or receiving mental health services using technology. Okay. Media has also been used to identify users with high suicide probabilities. Okay. So the goal for this study is to evaluate the presence and density of language related to 12 suicide factor risks on Twitter, and then analyze the relationships between suicide risk factors on Twitter. Okay. In terms of the methodology, using Twitter developer APIs, they retrieved 571,995 risky tweets that were initiated by 396,574 Twitter users between January 2014 and April 15, 2015. And that tweets were retrieved by searching Twitter for certain keywords, terms indicative of suicide risk factors. And these key search terms were defined in one of the previous studies, and they were exemplified in this table. So suicide risk factors, for example, for depressive feelings, search terms and statements that were used to retrieve these tweets were feel alone, depressed, I feel helpless, I feel sad, I feel empty. For example, another suicide risk factor was drug abuse, and search terms used for this were depressed, alcohol, sertraline, Zoloft, Prozac, pills, depressed. Then other suicide risk factors identified were prior suicide attempts, suicide around individuals, suicide ideation, self-harm, bullying, gun ownerships, psychological disorders, family violence, discord, and impulsivity. The first goal was to analyze the presence of these 12 risk factors on Twitter. So for each suicide risk factor, they generated a subnetwork to capture the presence of statement terms associated with the risk factors. Each subnetwork was then represented by a matrix called author-to-author matrix, in which each element in this matrix encoded the number of common terms and statements tweeted by both authors. Then they used a network density to measure the presence of the language associated with the risk factors. And they defined the density of this subnetwork as the total number of tweets containing terms of a risk factor divided by the number of pairs of users tweeting about that risk factor. And using this methodology, they found that 7 out of those 12 risk factors had densities greater than 70%, meaning that 70% of the tweets of these risk factors contain similar language patterns. Meaning that similar language patterns means users expressing their feelings using similar language patterns. As a result, it was easier to find users tweeting about that risk factors. And you can see here the list of the suicide risk factors with the number of search terms, number of users, number of risk tweets, and the density values calculated for each one of these risk factors. Second goal for the study was to find out the relationship between these 12 suicide risk factors. So the users were stratified, using 2 groups. There was one group, the high-risk user group, which was defined as the users who had tweets pertaining to prior suicide attempts and or self-harm suicide risk factors. And there was another group called at risk, in which users were the ones that did not have tweets containing language of prior suicide attempts and or self-harm suicide risk factors, but had the other factors present. They defined the relationship between a pairs of risk factors as the number of users within each group tweeting about both factors, and then co-occurrence matrices were generated that contain counts of users tweeting about pairs of risk factors for each group, high risk and at risk. And then Jeffy software was used to visualize at risk and at high risk networks using the Frachterman-Reingold layout. The nodes in the network were colored by type of risk factors with green, and I will show the network in a few slides, with green for social factors and red for physiological risk factors. The nodes were scaled by weighted degree of connectivity. They found that 44% of all users who tweeted at least one tweet of depressive feelings also tweeted at least a tweet of depressive symptoms for the high-risk group. This relationship is stronger than its respective value in the at-risk group, where it was only 39%. The relationship between depressive feelings, depressive symptoms, and all other factor risk was higher for high risk compared to at-risk group, except for self-harm. For prior suicide attempts, 30% of the users did tweet about self-harm in the high-risk group compared to only 8% in the at-risk group. Another finding was that depressive symptoms and depressive feelings were highly associated with drug abuse, which supports previous findings. Also, tweets about prior suicide attempts and self-harm were more strongly present with drug abuse tweets in the high-risk group. And finally, in general, we observe strong language patterns and relationships of several risk factors for the high-risk category. So here you can see the networks that were built to see the relationships between the risk factors within each one of the two groups of users. While psychological risk factors were present strongly with slightly different weights in both networks, the presence of social risk factors, including gun ownership, suicide around individual, family violence, and prior suicide attempts, is more pronounced in the high-risk group. We also found that bullying and depressive symptoms, two psychological risk factors, were also more pronounced in the high-risk group. And also in the at-risk group network, psychological factors, well described in the literature, strongly correlated with drug abuse. In conclusion, Twitter is an outlet for individuals to potential post-stressful feelings, emotional and thoughts. In this study, the analysis was performed to see the potential use of Twitter in suicide-related research. Using suicidal risk factors and the associated language used on Twitter, they have shown that language patterns of the majority suicide risk factors have strong presence in Twitter. Certain linguistic patterns pertaining to suicide risk factors are more frequently used by those who are at high risk of suicide, and tweets might be highly reflective of emotional and behavioral attributes of users and could be used as a valuable resource for predicting suicide. We'll take questions now. Thank you.